Good evening, everybody. A very, very warm welcome to each one of you for coming and joining into this webinar. So today I'm glad to introduce to you Kaustav Chakravarthy. He is the Executive Director, Global Human Resources at Johnson's Controls-Hitachi Air Conditioning. He has 20 years of professional experience in corporate HR and consulting with domain expertise in HR business partnering, talent and performance management, leadership development, and OD. So he's basically been there in the industry for many years, and he has helped devise and execute HR and learning strategy for over 50 organizations across 14 sectors. So with a very rich experience, Kaustav brings to us today a very interesting topic, which is about, and that is a topic very relevant to today's era or today's time, which is impact of COVID-19, how it has impacted and what are the challenges companies are facing in terms of talent management, what are the lessons learned, what are the key success factors, both for individuals as well as organizations to prepare for the long and difficult recovery ahead, or the long road ahead, I would say. So with this, over to you, Kaustav, completely.
Thank you so much. At any point, if I am not audible, please let me know. Unfortunately, my Bluetooth headset seems to have decided not to connect to the PC today, so we will go without it. So I hope my volume is okay and the connectivity is fine.
Yeah, you're perfectly audible, Kaustav, and I would request everybody else to keep on mute and to be available on video as much as.
Okay. I'm wondering if there's a way that I can share my desktop on this tool. I do have a couple of slides. I would like.
You can share screen there, Kaustav. On the bar, you can see a green.
Wonderful. I got it. Okay. So I'm sharing my PPT. Please just tell me if you can see this. Okay.
Can see.
All right. So I moved into slideshow mode. I hope this is okay. Right. Okay. All right. So thank you very much for that introduction. I really appreciate it. I've had the benefit of working for several organizations over the last 21 odd years, of which the HR portfolio has been my chosen field for perhaps 17 or 18 years. I started off my career way back in 1997 with Robert Bosch, or MICO as it was known in those days, where I was hired off from campus and then sent off to an MBA program, which was company sponsored. This was a German program, which meant that I was able to rotate through almost every department of the sponsoring company as a part of my MBA, which is a very unique thing that Germany does. And so therefore my exposure to human resources started off right then, where I spent close to 6 or 7 months as part of my MBA program working closely with MICO's human resources department. Thereafter, I moved into the Jaipur plant of MICO, where I was handling, among other things, human resources policies, payroll, etc., etc. After that, I've seen a series of other organizations. Without spending too much time on it, I've spent close to a decade working with a niche OD and L&D consulting firm called Shiksha Consulting, where I was a business head. And after that, I've spent good periods of time with companies like Ernst & Young, Accenture, Lenovo, and now my current employer, Johnson Controls-Hitachi Air Conditioning, handling various areas of HR. Initially started off with L&D and OD in the corporate space, and then quickly moved into generalist HR. And in my last 2 assignments, I have been leading human resources end-to-end for the respective companies across multiple geographies. In my previous company, Lenovo, I used to lead what was called the Central Asia Pacific region, which is all the ASEAN countries plus Hong Kong, Taiwan, and Korea. And in my current organization, I have a global mandate. So except for Japan, I lead human resources end-to-end for all of the other countries. It's a team of about 75 people, including both HR and general administration resources. And together we support an audience of around 10,000 people, 8 to 10,000 depending on the time of the year, and a business of size of about $2 billion. So that's in a nutshell my career. Now, so therefore, I think what was very interesting in my experience in this COVID time was that I had rather rare ringside seat into how large, complex global organizations react to these kind of global crises. And as you all would well agree, the COVID crisis was something with no parallel, at least in most of our careers. This is what we are popularly now referring to as a black swan event. I mean, you know that there is something like this that exists out there in the universe, but it is so rare and so special that when you encounter one of them, you have no idea what to do, right? And that is precisely how COVID hit all of us. So what I intend to share today with all of you is the learnings that I have derived as a corporate HR leader with a global mandate handling this COVID-19 crisis, and what shifts that has resulted in from a talent management perspective, and therefore what it means for all of us in the human resources function or discipline going forward. Questions are welcome at any point of time, but I may at some points request you to hold on to those questions depending on what they are, because we may well be covering them at some point later in the presentation. But otherwise, please feel free to either use the chat function or unmute yourselves and ask your specific questions. And if I can answer them then and there, that would be great. I structured the presentation in a way that we will spend about 30 to 35 minutes in terms of my content. I have very few slides, probably 4 or 5 content slides. And once those are over, there's enough time for us to converse as colleagues and fellow professionals in terms of maybe specific scenarios that you would like to talk through, or any questions that you might have. So I hope that's okay with everybody.
Yes, perfect.
Brilliant. Thank you. All right. So as you might see from my background, I'm right now sitting in a hotel room. And the reason is that I flew from India to Singapore yesterday as part of one of the Vande Bharat flights. And as per the local government regulations, I'm now serving 14 days of stay-at-home notice in a government-sponsored facility. The only difference is that government-sponsored in Singapore means the Shangri-La Hotel. So welcome to my hotel room at the Shangri-La. So I am actually even now in the thick of the crisis, which is a bit of a strange coincidence, but there you go. So there has been a significant change in how we operate as a global business. So we were all hit by the COVID shock sometime in February or so, which is when those of us who have business exposure to China first realized that this crisis is far more severe than anything that we had anticipated before. Now, in my company's case, we are basically an air conditioning manufacturer around the world. Any Hitachi air conditioners that you might have seen or you might have in your residences are manufactured by us. Most probably, if you're in India, then they were manufactured in Kadi, in near Ahmedabad. We have a large plant over there that's more than 20, 25 years old. And similar to this, we have plants in 7 or 8 other major locations around the world, including 4 major plants in China. There's a research and development center there. There are several large office hubs over there, plus large plants in Japan, in Southeast Asia, in Europe, as well as in South America. And except for the Japan plants, all of these plants are part of my remit. I have team members stationed over there who report to me on a daily basis and who I'm responsible for. And so as we saw the crisis kind of evolve, the uniqueness of our situation meant that we were faced with almost the full brunt of the complexity of this crisis worldwide. Why am I saying this? Because number one, we have a global spread, as I just shared with you, in terms of office and people. Number two, that we are not just a sales or a trading organization, but a full-fledged end-to-end organization, starting with manufacturing, all through the intervening functions up to owning the end product and the market and routes to market and reaching our end customers. So the amount of complexity that our business carries meant that the crisis hit us in many different ways that absolutely sometimes were impossible to anticipate, even with prior knowledge of how we had dealt with this crisis in some other country. And of course, in terms of the type of company that we are a brick and mortar organization, which means that we have a fairly aged workforce. The average median age of my workforce is approximately 46 or 47. Most people, therefore, kind of average between the 40 and the 55 age range. Although by country there is some variation, and especially with a disease like this, which affects more aged people more severely, the potential impact on the health and safety of our workforce is far higher than perhaps in some other companies which operate with lesser median ages. So this is quite a significant challenge, ongoing challenge for us to keep our employees safe and at the same time to safeguard our economic interests. So that's where I'm coming from. So the COVID shock is pretty interesting. Now, very quickly to summarize where we are today, I pulled these off of Google today. You can easily access this data. But as you can see, we are today at about 14.5 million cases. And just so if we put this in context, when the cases were first reported early January by China to World Health Organization, I think the total number of cases was in the tens of thousands. And so this is a massive, massive spread of the disease worldwide. Now, although a bulk of these people have already recovered, we've still had more than 0.6 million, 600,000 people who tragically lost their lives due to this crisis. Some countries are worse affected than the others, and the rate of increase of the per day cases has affected certain countries much more severely than the others, but other countries are quickly catching on at this point. Now, in terms of my two homes, India and Singapore, these graphs are probably not surprises to you. The India picture seems to be worsening on a daily basis. Today, for the first time, we hit about 40,000 cases per day in that country. And this number has actually grown from around, a few hundred cases per day in early April to where we are today in just 3 months. Notwithstanding the fact that we've had several rounds of lockdowns and individual states are still imposing lockdown conditions of their own. The number of deaths has also become quite significant in India. And I think, unfortunately, the government is still grappling with the dual challenges of keeping people safe while at the same time ensuring productivity. Singapore has a very different situation. Several factors in this kind of situation work in Singapore government's favor. For one, it is basically a very small country, perhaps the size of a very large city in Indian terms. And number two, it's an island, which means the number of access points to the country can be very specifically enumerated and controlled. So every checkpoint can be controlled. The airport, the international airport, although it's one of the best in the world and the largest in the world, is still just one airport. And therefore, policies can be easily implemented in this airport. And so the number of imported cases, as we call them, which is really where the disease comes from to any new country these days, it can be very tightly managed, monitored, and controlled. Plus, of course, the fact that the Singapore government has been at the forefront of technology adoption, and it's a first world country with a huge amount of resources to throw at the problem. So this makes the disease management a very different story in the case of Singapore than perhaps in the case of India, which is a very large country with a widely distributed population, large number of migrant labor, relatively low technology adoption in the government, and resource constraints. So you can see that in case of Singapore, the number of cases peaked were actually quite stable till about early March, early April or end of March. But then we realized in this country that there's a very large population of people who seem to have been flying under the radar, but where the infection was spreading very widely. And that is what are called the migrant labor dormitories in Singapore. So Singapore also has a very large percentage of its population as migrant labor, usually drawn from neighboring countries. And these people are housed in specially constructed dormitories where, because of the nature of their work, they may not be living in the country permanently, but they're brought in on contract based on special visas, housed in these dormitories. They execute their employment, and at the end of the employment contract, they return to their home countries. And so while the general population did not see a very large spread of the disease, and the government had various measures such as the circuit breaker, which is the most recent one, which succeeded in controlling the spread of the infection quite significantly, the the migrant worker dormitories, unfortunately, were areas that were flying under the radar and which saw huge numbers of infections. So almost all of these infections that we see here are in the migrant worker dormitories. And again, the government has taken massive steps to keep those people safe and to test and diagnose the number of cases and proactively monitor them, so that you can see that the approach has really worked in the case of Singapore. So we have countries that look like this, like India, and we have countries in the world that look like this. Some of the countries that look like this actually are South Korea, Taiwan, of course, Singapore, Sweden, New Zealand, Germany. And on the other hand, unfortunately, there are the countries that have graphs looking like this, which include some of the world's most developed countries, like the United States of America or the UK, right? Without going to the merits of how this whole thing, devolved, and it's not the focus of our program. I think as far as we were concerned as an organization, we started off with countries where the curve now looks like this. So the initial spread of the disease started in China, where we have several large facilities, as I shared. And that peak really started off around what we call the Chinese New Year, which usually happens around the 3rd or the 4th week of January and stretches on to the 1st week of February. It's basically the spring harvest festival, similar to perhaps Sankranti in India. And what happens in this festival times is the world's largest movement of migrant workers takes place in a matter of a week. Literally tens of millions of people travel from urban centers in China to their rural homes and spend this time with their families, celebrating and exchanging festive gifts and so on and so forth. It's literally a week to 10 days of gala family gatherings around the country. And just a week before that is when the crisis really escalated and cities in China started shutting down. Now, how this works for us was pretty fascinating. I did want to show you this, right? I mean, this was the progression of events for me as a global HR leader. I remember working pretty late one night and realizing that one by one, my Chinese plants are shutting down. It's almost like you have lights on the globe and the lights are kind of switching off city by city, right? So fortunately, we had no large plants or sales setups in Wuhan, which was the epicenter of the disease in China. But we did have large plants in all of the neighboring provinces. So we have a fairly large plant in Wuhu, a large research and development center in Wuxi. We have 2 plants in the Guangdong province. We have very large office centers in Beijing and Shanghai. And these are kind of surrounding provinces to Wuhan, where the crisis started. And so initially, while Wuhan itself was shut down and movement of labor between the province of Wuhan and the neighboring provinces was severely restricted, what that meant for us was that we saw a significant drop of contract labor or temporary labor coming in from these places. And this is the peak manufacturing season for us, because in the run up to summer, which is usually in the Northern Hemisphere between the months of say March, April, and June or July in different countries. So the Jan to March period is peak production season for us, where we pile up inventories and get ready to market them during the summer season. And so this was the period when China was actually ramping up very quickly in terms of production. And then we realized that labor shortage was going to hit us quite hard. Little did we know that the labor shortage would be the least of our problems, because within a couple of days, the disease had also spread to the Guangdong province and the neighboring provinces where we had Wuxi and Wuhu and these other cities. And maybe a couple of days later, Shanghai and Beijing also got affected and quickly turned things around there. So as these plants started quickly going offline, the initial reaction, as you might expect, was one of bewilderment and panic. We had no idea what was happening. Our primary focus was to keep our workforce safe. We knew that the disease was hogging headlines all over, and therefore at that point it was still a Chinese problem. But from being a Wuhan problem, it was rapidly escalating into a problem engulfing the entire country. So the initial steps we took were all to make sure that our people were all well connected. We were well informed of their status. People knew that plants had to be shut down, machineries had to be turned off in a particular order. So the plant was safe for people, and at the same time, our people were safe and confined to their respective homes. Government rules were being followed as required. And of course, at that point, the confusion was supreme because even the governments did not know sometimes what they were to do in a particular situation, right? There was no unified national policy for handling the pandemic in China. Individual city and provincial governments were forced to handle them as best they could in the initial stages of the disease as the virus started spreading. So keeping track of all of these changing government regulations and eventually making sure that we are responding to circumstances as and when they arise. That took a huge amount of bandwidth. I don't remember sleeping much in the first few days as we mobilized a global response to keep our Chinese employees safe. And at the same time, we realized that other countries were slowly shutting off air travel from mainland China. So we also have fairly large facilities in other countries that are dependent on our Chinese plants for their output. So countries like Taiwan, where we have a 40-year-old facility with thousands of employees, sorry. India, which is also a very large facility and has a close relationship with China plants. Malaysia, which is another plant. So part of the company was also dealing with supply chain constraints impacting all of these plants in a cascading way. And at the senior management levels, therefore, we had a limited group of leaders who had to chase multiple numbers of problems and crises and handle them from a company perspective, from a legal perspective, as well as from a human resources perspective. So it was a pretty scary time. I think what really worked for us was the fact that we were deployed around the world, and therefore, as leadership, we could very quickly start pinging people, getting people onto common platforms and communication, figure out what is happening, and keep ourselves communicated and respond quite rapidly to the problem. The other thing was something called zero harm. As a policy, we have something called a zero harm policy in our company, which mandates that as far as possible, we will not put either our employees or our customers or our stakeholders or anyone in society to harm as a result of our business actions. This is extremely important for a company like us, which is the air conditioning space, because as you might remember, not too long ago, air conditioning or cooling industry was responsible for the ozone layer depletion to a significant degree because of the CFC chemicals that were being used in industrial cooling in those days. Of course, this problem has been diagnosed more than 20 years ago, and since then, CFC usage has almost completely been abolished. Today, we use different types of chemicals which do not impact the ozone layer, and just a couple of months back, we saw some news that the ostensible gap in the ozone layer has now completely closed. But because of this experience, the industry itself is very strongly geared towards environment, social implications of its work, et cetera, et cetera. And so in our company's case, the zero harm policy was one of the results of that 2 decades of effort to preserving the environment and being socially responsible. So as a result of the zero harm policy, we had to very quickly come up with protocols to keep our employees safe. We went far beyond mere basic governmental regulations in this respect. For example, making sure that tens of thousands of personal protective equipment were shipped to China to keep our employees safe is one of the things we did. Instituting social distance norms within the plant, which are more than what was the minimum required by governments, is another thing that we did, and proactively in some other plants cases. So much so that in many of our plants, the unions came back and were very appreciative of the fact that we took a lot of effort to keep our people safe. Right? But all of this required a huge amount of coordinated effort. During the midst of a crisis where shipping was being shut down, government regulations were changing, people were sometimes overnight confined to their residences because of a lockdown in a particular area of a city or an entire city and so on. And therefore, what we saw between, say, late February and mid-March, or maybe the 3rd week of March, was just a phenomenal shift in how we operated in the Asia-Pacific region. Now, to the Chinese government's credit, between the 2nd week of February and perhaps the 2nd week of March, the Chinese government had more or less managed to control in very strict terms the spread of the virus within China. We've seen some videos about how this was done. People have different opinions about civil liberties and so on and so forth. But we have to realize that the country was going through an existential crisis. And as a result of that, China was one of the countries that managed to do the best jobs around the world in terms of controlling the spread of the virus. And by the 3rd week of March, after almost 3 and a half weeks of intense round the clock action and coordination for us as an organization, we could feel the pressure ebbing slightly. By then, the virus had been controlled in many cities. Some districts were starting to lift travel restrictions. We started seeing migrant labor returning to our factories through contractors for work. So we could once again slowly, but with enough protective measures, pick up our production and return to profitability in those places once again. Now, you might be of the opinion that in a time like this, we should be focusing on human safety and security, and profitability should be the least of our concerns. But anyone who is in business will tell you that if money isn't flowing the business is only maybe 2 or 3 weeks away from dying. It doesn't matter how big a business you are, right? Most businesses operate on 21 days or 25 days worth of cash flow available in case of crises. Nobody expects something like the coronavirus to come and hit you. So it doesn't matter if we are able to keep all of our employees safe. If we can't keep the money rotating in the business, then these same employees will have no job because the company will crash in a month or 2 months of this time. So the company has to, at very rapid pace, establish credit lines with banks to keep its liquidity position safe, and tap sources of funds which are immediately required to keep working capital in the business. And these lenders are only going to lend to you if they know that they have a reasonable guarantee of getting their money back, which means they have to see you being a responsible business operator as well. So the point is to balance out safety of the employees with, at the same time, reasonable amount of productivity which we can run given the reality of business at the ground level. So while safety continues to be the top priority, you cannot sacrifice economic safety of the company also. So we have to draw a balancing act between the two. So that was happening. Now, fortunately, because of some of our challenging but responsible decisions that we took, we were able to establish credit lines both through the parent company and otherwise. And we did have a fair amount of cash reserves in the company. So that made it easier for us to deal with this case in a strong manner so that we kept our people safe as far as we could. Right? But the result was that in some factories, we were not producing at all. We completely shut down the plant to keep our people safe. In some plants, the production happened at very, very low percentage of total, maybe 25% or 30% or maximum maybe 50% of the total. And almost everybody who could afford to work from home, who were not actually really required to work from an office, started working from home. So the radically transformed work landscape that we have was that overnight, people who were supposed to go to office and were going to office maybe even just 2 or 3 days back had to figure out how to work from home. Now, this made massive transformations happen in the company overnight. One of the biggest transformations was the immediate and rapid adoption of collaborative workspace tools like Microsoft Teams. As a company, we had been working on multiple communication platforms for the past 3 or 4 years since the joint venture was first created, right? Just to give you an idea, we had almost 7 or 8 different communication tools that were being used. We had, of course, the regular Avaya phones, but we also had Microsoft Teams, we had Link and Skype, we had Yammer. There were some other tools that were being used in small pockets in isolation. But as a result of this crisis, everybody realized that you all have to be on one tool. And that tool has to be flexible enough to accommodate not just phone calls or video calls, but also collaborative working, things like desktop sharing, whiteboarding together, messaging, and so on and so forth. And so essentially what happened was that at the end of this exercise, the best tool won out. And in our case, that best tool was Microsoft Teams. So in a matter of, say, a week's time, everybody in the company was in Microsoft Teams, not just in our company, but also in the parent company. And we were exchanging information, teams were being created, files were being shared, workflows were being done. I mean, we were at a level of maturity that ramped up like that. Now, while this sounds very impressive, the reality of getting to that endpoint was that it was very painful because, as I shared earlier, a large percentage of my population is above the age of 45. And some of these people were not very tech savvy. In fact, they had spent years rejecting and obstructing the movement of the progress of technology because they were not comfortable with it. And yet here they were overnight requiring to use technology or get left behind. Their effectiveness as managers, their productivity as leaders was being compromised because they were not able to keep pace with technology. And we had to very quickly do training sessions, coaching sessions, counseling sessions to make sure that people are adopting and using technology as they're supposed to. So that was how this whole thing happened. And now Then from China, the virus kind of moved slowly to the west. So while within Asia Pacific, I think uh, the fact that we had a lot of experience handling SARS and H1N1 made it easier for almost all the countries in this region to control the virus very quickly. As the virus moved to the west, especially in Europe and then towards the US, they were really caught unawares. So even today, when you look at the countries in Asia Pacific that have had a vast experience in handling pandemics or epidemics, you find that these are doing relatively well. So, for example, we had a small lockdown, you might call a movement control order in Malaysia, but in case of a country like Thailand or Vietnam, we really never had any lockdowns there. Taiwan is one of the least affected countries today because it very quickly moved to address the problem and therefore was able to reopen its economy within maybe say 3 weeks of its first case. Singapore, the story is well known. It's a gold standard today in handling these cases. India seems to be worsening at this point, but I would still have a lot of faith in the government because this is a country that has handled epidemics for decades and decades and decades. And so the machinery that is at the back end handling these cases is not new. They don't need to be trained. They know exactly what they're doing. Just that a coordinated central government response is required to bring everybody in all the states together. And then the disease can and will be fairly easily controlled. But in the case of Eastern European or Western European countries, or in the case of the United States or South American countries, they really had very little experience in dealing with epidemics. And you could see that in the way that the epidemics overwhelmed their medical infrastructure within weeks. And so, I remember speaking to some of my HR leaders in those countries early on, and the feedback I got was, hey, this is a Chinese problem. It'll never come here. Even if it does, our medical systems will be more than enough to handle it. And yet, just a week later, these were the same countries that were absolutely overwhelmed in terms of the medical infrastructure, right? And so they had to kind of go through a very painful learning curve in handling the disease. But fortunately for a company like us, because we had this experience of handling the crisis in China and in other Asia Pacific countries between the third week of February and probably the second week of March, as Europe started escalating in around the mid of March or the third week of March, we were already able to take many of the learnings from these other countries and implement them in our plants in these countries. So, keeping pace with government regulations for safe distancing in a plant is pretty complex. How do you change an assembly line? How do you retool it so that you have 1 meter or 2 meter distance between two people on the same assembly line? This is a problem that many companies in Europe had to contend with. But because we had already done something like this in China, we were able to copy and implement those measures in our plant in Spain, and therefore keep our employees much safer there. Same thing with our operations in Brazil or in North America as well. So this has been a kind of journey, right? As you're well aware, the current status is Europe now seems to be on the wane. In many countries, unlike procedures have taken, the number of people infected by the disease or even the number of deaths on a daily basis has been steadily dropping. Unfortunately, regrettably, Brazil and North America, the US, are two countries that are severely hit, and due to various political reasons, they just don't seem to be getting their act together, and still being very cautious about our employees in these two places to keep them safe. But today, in terms of talent management, I think we have reached some sort of equilibrium, and we have established and adapted best practices around the world, which I think we can share as real life learnings as the result of this pandemic, which we know will also happen, will also be expressed in the other countries in just a period of time. So what were those tectonic shifts that we started seeing in the talent markets, especially I would say in the months of April, May, June, and then July, as the pandemic started seeing up curves and then down curves in various countries. Number one, I think, as I mentioned, there are huge political-social shifts that have happened, especially in the last, say, 2 months, right? As a result of this pandemic, as you're well aware, the employment market has really, really dropped. GDP has dropped by massive percentage points year on year in the last 2-3 months. Couple of quarters. Singapore saw a 40% drop in GDP month on month in the month of July. The US has seen a 40% drop in GDP as well. In terms of employment, the numbers are just so huge that it's unimaginable. In the US, I think the unemployment claims that were lodged came up to about 20 or more than 20 million people unemployed in just in a matter of 3 weeks. This was in the mid of May or early part of June. And July has not been a lot better. We are seeing a slight reduction in unemployment at this point, but the number of people unemployed is still very, very high. Just so you know, the total workforce in the US is approximately 165,000 people. And so, 20 million people is roughly 10-15% of the workforce. It's just a huge number of people that are unemployed. In India, the situation is not very different from some numbers that I recently read. Up to 40 million or 50 million people have lost their jobs in the last 3 or 4 months, sorry. Of which approximately 25% are white collar workers, and the remaining 75% are basically blue collar or labor, daily labor. Many industries have come to a standstill, as some of you are well aware. The hospitality industry, the construction industry, and migrant labor has been forced to trudge across hundreds or even thousands of kilometers sometimes to get back to their homes, home cities, hometowns, or home villages, because public transport was shut down. And as a result, many of them are now hesitant to come back to urban centers. So we are likely to see massive unemployment, redistribution of labor, and significant impact to industries for many months, if not many years to come, at least in India, right? All of these, and the situation is kind of similar in many other countries as well. Different countries have reacted differently to quell the immediate impact of these crises. But in almost all countries, you can see the governments taking welfare-oriented measures to put money back into the hands of their people in the short term. Now, in some countries, this has come as wage subsidies. So employers are given certain wage benefits in order to not furlough people or put people out of employment, which means that part of the salary is a significant portion, 70 or even 80% in some countries' cases, is being reimbursed by the government. In other cases, governments are relaxing labor laws and allowing employers to negotiate with employee groups, unions or works councils, to put people on temporary furloughs or to reduce wages for a time being in an attempt to reduce the possibility of unemployment of people. Because I think one thing is very clear, that once jobs disappear in this market, it's going to take a long time for those jobs to come back. So incentivizing employers to keep people on rolls as far as possible is a very strong strategic method to keep social harmony in place. But other than that, I think we're also seeing tax rebates. We're seeing a slew of financial measures in terms of credit for small and medium businesses, or even large businesses in some countries. And the net impact of all of this is that almost every government has gone into protection mode to keep its workforce employed and to keep social harmony intact in society. So this means that movement of labor, both within the country as well as outside the country, has been between countries has been significantly affected. Today, markets between which labor movement was quite fluid and quite frequent are seeing those movements break down and barriers come up. For example, there's frequent movement of people between China and Japan. And in our case, because we're a Japan headquartered company, we would have a lot of people at leadership levels moving from Japan to China to manage business there. Today, we cannot do this, not because there are immigration limitations, so to speak, but because of practical considerations. Number one, people are scared that they may acquire an infection when they go to China. Number two, there is a practical consideration of these quarantines or stay-at-home notices, like the one that I shared with you a little earlier. So if every time you visit a certain city and come back, you have to mandatorily undergo, say, a 7-day quarantine or a 14-day quarantine, it's no longer practical from a business standpoint to send anybody to that place. You've got to try and manage it virtually as far as possible. Also, many countries are giving incentives to businesses to relocate their overseas manufacturing operations in their own countries. Japan, for instance, has come up with, I think, several $1 billion worth of incentive to relocate manufacturing facilities from China and other countries back into itself. We're seeing repeats of this in other countries as well. So what the end result is that mobility of labor between geographies is going to be severely affected as a result of this crisis. At the same time, governments have been forced to very rapidly pass labor laws that try and strike a balance between protecting their workforces and compensating industry for their losses, as well as incentivizing further investment by industry in the future. As you're well aware, Europe, India, the US, Singapore, almost all major economies in the world have passed bills amounting to significant percentages of GDP, upward of 10% up to maybe 20% of GDP, to invest in liquidity for their business environment, right? And this money has to come from somewhere. So in the case of a country with a trade surplus or significant deep pockets, for example, like Singapore, it would be possible for it to withdraw some of its savings, investments in other countries and businesses, and flow that money into revitalizing its economy through a stimulus measure. In the case of the US, the situation is very unique because they print the dollar, and the dollar is the reserve currency by default in the world. So it doesn't really matter how many dollars they print. The value of the dollar is not going to fall in the short term in an economy which is on the verge of crisis like this. Which is why you're seeing that even as they print nearly 20, $25 trillion worth of incentives, the value of the dollar has not really dropped significantly. It's still almost at pre-COVID levels in the global exchange market, with a few exceptions, right? European economic stimulus packages are based on different principles. But they will still be, not so impactful from an inflation perspective. India is a different case, however. In India, the only way to finance these stimulus packages is through deficit financing, which basically means the government will have to print rupees in the several years in the future, and that means that there's a very high inflationary pressure on the Indian rupee in the years coming forward, and that will in turn make imports, especially petroleum imports, significantly costlier, which is one reason why the government has not reduced the price of fuel, despite the fact that globally the price of crude oil have significantly dropped in the past few months. What the government has rather done is stacked up its strategic reserves and continues to derive a significant amount of tax from the fuel, which will go into the fuel taxation reserve and come back to keep the prices of fuel stable in the future, possibly when the rupee is allowed to depreciate to allow for the deficit financing. So there's just a huge amount of predictable, in some case, unpredictable politico-economical consequences of this whole. Secondly, technological. As I shared with you, remote working, co-working, collaborative working, these are huge trends in the economy, in the global industry today, that could not even be predicted a couple of months before. But yet, as of today, if these trends are not carefully observed, you will find large parts of our workforce becoming obsolete because they don't have the relevant skills to manage people virtually and get jobs done virtually. And industries where the average age or the median age is on the higher side, this risk is much higher. For a company like us, we have to be very, very sensitive to this kind of a tectonic shift and what it means for our own internal talent. Third, in terms of talent, there are multiple challenges. Number one, as I already shared earlier, there is a mobility challenge. Number two is about multi-skilling. There used to be a period when people could acquire very deep specialized skills in specific areas and thereafter be confident that their value as a professional would stay significant throughout their careers. I think in today's world, this is no longer. It's no longer enough that you're a specialist in one field, for example, human resources. But because of the unpredictable ways in which the business landscape is changing, you also need to be an expert in remote working and collaboration technologies, or at least how to use them effectively. You need to know how to manage teams and subordinates remotely, right? Your ability to be a program manager or a project manager is very, very important today, because considering the rapidly changing cost landscape around the world, it's quite possible that companies will tend to retain only core functions within themselves and try and figure out ways to outsource non-core functions in a much more aggressive fashion compared to maybe even a few months ago. And this no longer applies only to certain economies. I can quickly see something like this happening even in countries that have traditionally been the recipients of outsourcing, like, for example, India or the Philippines, where in turn work is being boxed out to other regions within the same country, because no longer is urban center an important talent market. One of the huge benefits that remote working collaboration tools have brought to today's economy virtually overnight is that tier 2, tier 3 cities are opening up in terms of talent hubs. And people are realizing today that you really, in a situation where in any case, 70 or 80% of the population has to work from home, you might as well have your developmental center, let's say in Pondicherry or in Trichy or in some other small city, which is typically not seen as a prime target for a corporate to open a shared services center or a back office center, but which still has a large number of highly qualified, motivated employees, graduates waiting there to get a job. Only thing is that they might not have been able to relocate to an urban center because of various reasons. But now in their own hometowns, they're getting these jobs at significantly lower pay compared to a tier one urban center, but a very good pay compared to the local pay scales. And that's working out as a win-win for everybody. So talent mobility being impacted is not just at the global level, but within your own country itself. And that is in turn driving massive outsourcing opportunities in country. Location agnostic, as I just shared, and very importantly, tech plus human, which again, I just shared. Today, it's not just enough to be an expert in your functional domain. You should also be an expert in collaborative technologies and working remotely in order to be a successful professional. So these are massive talent tectonic shifts that I have. Now, let's step back a bit and try and recognize certain organizational transformations which are also impacting the talent market. Number one, as people have been working from home, one of the impacts that have happened is that they no longer need to spend, say, 2 hours a day commuting to their work and back. So this has increased both their available time for work as well as their available time for their families and for themselves. And so we are seeing a lot of employees now taking the time to reimagine their own careers, ask themselves some fundamental existential questions as they spend more time contemplating their careers and their value choices, value preferences and their work choices, getting into training and so forth. We find a lot of people having the time to ask some very fundamental questions. Am I in the right job? Should I be thinking of a different career line? Should I be doing some learning to empower myself to make the next move in my career? Should I, for example, leave this city and go back to my hometown because it really doesn't matter where I am in terms of physical location anymore? And so one of the questions that these people are asking themselves is, what kind of organization should I be associated with? Is this the right company? Do I like how this organization treated me and my colleagues and other people and other stakeholders during this crisis, which is really a defining crisis in terms of the organization's value systems, right? And some people are finding the answer to be very good, very positive. For example, a lot of my colleagues, my friends who are in TCS, are completely praises for that company and the way that it showed its true empathetic human side, both to its employees as well as customers and stakeholders during this crisis. But equally, there are also a lot of colleagues and friends who are very dissatisfied with how they perceive their company as having managed the way forward through the crisis. And there's one of the implications of that is that people have started moving. Those of you in the talent acquisition space will agree with me that as talent markets slowly start opening up, you're finding a lot of people willing to move because they're not satisfied with the way in which their current company treated them or their colleagues, and so you're finding a cascading impact on these positions in turn opening up again because they have to rapidly fill them, especially if they're crucial positions or critical from a senior management perspective or so on, right? So one of the underlying themes that I think people are starting to realize is taking hold in the labor market is that people are being attracted to purpose-driven companies rather than purely profit-driven companies. And the more principled, the more purpose-driven people perceive a company to be, the more likely the top talent in any organization, in any industry is likely to apply and try to migrate to that employer. Secondly is efficiency to empathy. What does this mean? So in the past, I think during steady state, when the whole point of business is to run faster than the competitor, acquire more customers, try and minimize your expenses and maximize your profit, efficiency becomes easily the focus point, right? But during a crisis like this, when you realize that you've had to change fundamentally how you work, people around you, including at very senior leadership levels, all the way down to the entry level, are having to face massive personal and family challenges while at the same time trying to remain productive on the work front. And working from home is not a very comfortable proposition for many people. People suffer isolation. There's psychological impacts on people who are used to working in a shared workspace with their colleagues for perhaps years or decades together in the past, right? They're having to face a huge amount of stress and pressure because many people might be staying in small apartments where it's not easy to maintain a noise-free or a disturbance-free ecosystem for them to work effectively. the Wi-Fi might be cutting off, they don't have enough rooms available, people, maybe both spouses need to work from the same residence at the same time that, the child or two children or three children need to log on to school, which is also virtual, which means the bandwidth keeps cutting off. So there are all these practical problems which are leading to a fallout from an emotional standpoint. And so today, if the manager is only driving efficiency, it does not work anymore. It's more important for the manager to also be empathetic at all levels of the organization. And so companies are realizing that they have to learn the skill of empathy and propagate it across their manager community in order to be effective and productive during these times. And finally, there's this interesting trend called traditionalism to agility. Traditional work environments typically involved an office, a certain set of work timings, a set of, a job description that called out certain reports to be done or certain responsibilities to be managed. But in today's world, the concept of office is broken down. You no longer have certain set work timings sometimes because you're working cross-border, cross-geography. And because of the nature of unpredictability in this work circumstances, people who are entrepreneurial and who are of the type who will set their own priorities, go and solve problems and collaborate with others are far more in demand and far more effective than someone who puts a clock on their table and says, here's my task list and I will only do this much and not much more. So the workforce is becoming a lot more flexible by default. We have really no choice in the process. And people who realize and pace with this new change are valued as resources and team members significantly higher. We're going to see impacts of this in the years to come. Okay, so I'm going to end with this one slide. I think there are certain positive emerging corporate trends which are important for all of us, both as leaders as well as individual employees and team members. Number one, ideas or appearances. It used to be that, for example, if you had a 6-foot high figure and a deep baritone voice, you could cast a certain spell over people in a physical meeting environment. So you would have, a seat at the table, your opinions would influence people through physical communication. Today, that doesn't work anymore. Today, everybody is the same 3 by 3 inch window in my webcam platform. And over that platform, how big you are or how dominating you are doesn't really carry through. What carries through is the strength of your ideas. So as a result, we're seeing traditionally under-encouraged constituencies, right? Like women in leadership positions, people from small towns, people from remote offices, LGBTQ community. All of these people have seen a huge opportunity to present their ideas and gain acceptance in the corporate leadership world. And therefore, the landscape of leadership around the corporate world is actually changing. And that's a huge positive. Rise of social capital. So again, no longer is enough for a person, a profession to be an expert in their professional domain. Today, the way in which you're able to take people along with you and get an idea executed across borders, across cultures, across time zones is far more valuable than just your specific functional domain area of expertise. So people who are able to do this are at a distinct advantage for growth and prosperity than people who are not. And the third is the true culture of learning. I think what this pandemic has taught all of us is that it's not just enough to keep doing training programs, certifications. You need to be able to unlearn and relearn at a moment's notice, even very fundamental life skills or work skills, like working with technology, working across time zones, and so on and so forth. And so people who adopt this true culture of learning, who are constantly in it to improve themselves and contribute more to the organization, are again being found to be significantly more valuable than the others who are kind of taking a back foot or a reactive approach towards the skill. So in a nutshell, this is where we are from a talent management perspective. I think going forward, we are going to have to focus not just on hard skills, but we need to, especially at managerial level, very strongly focus on responsiveness, collaboration, resilience, empathy. Basically, the EQ part, other than the IQ part, in order to run a global, remotely connected, co-working organization, which will still have a strong positive impact as we find our way through this crisis. And potentially, if we are fortunate, a vaccine may be available maybe in 18 to 24 months' time. But one of the realities that this whole scenario has exposed us to is that this is just the first of many such pandemics. We have already had 4 pandemics in the last 10 years: the SARS virus, H1N1 virus, MERS virus, and now COVID-19, right? And so in the next decade, who knows, we may have another 4 such pandemics. And so companies around the world are really looking at remote working, collaboration, etc., as endemic parts of their working DNA, which means that we will always have people working from home. We will always have backup programs. BCP protocols will be updated to include a new pandemic protocol, as written in our company. And so this is just the way that we are going to have to learn to work going forward. So with that, I'm done. I'll hand it over back to you and open questions.
Thank you so much, Kaustav. It was so wonderful to hear. And, it's something like both individuals and organizations over the time, and nobody was prepared. This was completely unprecedented, right? And very unexpected crisis. And wherein organizations, individuals, both of them have evolved over time, they have learned over time, and have been able to manage things over time. So if there's any questions, if you'll have, you can unmute yourself and please feel free to ask question to Kaustav, or if you want, you can put it in the chat as well. So yes, Mona, you're raising your hand. Please go ahead.
Hi, Kaustav. It was very nice. You can hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. So, I wanted to ask one thing. COVID, of course, was a surprise, and HR had to restructure, strategize, and a lot of things for retention and the work. And you say that remote is a very good option, but then yours is a manufacturing unit. You are in production. So how do you justify? Because with the government lockdown 1, 2, 3, 4, the lockdown rules kept changing, and the companies had to work again on who would come. 1/3 workforce would come. So how do you justify the salary or the people who are coming in the production, because this is not a remote industry, yours, which can function only on remote?
Good question, and quite practical one that we had to grapple with over the past few months, right? Now, obviously, we can't produce from home. So working from home has, you have to be at the factory. And
absolutely.
There's no choice.
And you can't call all the workforce also. So how do you manage that?
So we need to take a longer term view. We know that at the end of the day, the fundamental competitiveness of the company does not get impacted by a crisis of this nature. Our air conditioning products are still top of the line, best technology, consumer accepted. Our brand is still strong. So the demand is going to come back. The fundamental nature of my business does not change unless the global weather changes. And to be very frank with you, when I say the global weather changes, I mean that the global weather becomes very Bangalore-like around the world. Then I will have to worry. But the way that things are going right now, weather becoming more unpredictable, at the same time, disposable income increasing among our customer base only means better and better things for us. So just so you know, even in the pandemic, during the months of the pandemic, globally, our company has still made profit. We have still sold enough ACs to turn black. So that fundamentally demonstrates the strength of my business. Now, with that economic basis, I have to take a very long-term view of whether, as a result of this crisis, I should take the risk of fundamentally impacting negatively my production capability. Even if my plant is not able to produce for this month or this week, does it make sense for me to fire half of my workforce? No, it does not. Probably not, right? So to some degree, we have to be flexible in terms of the workforce. For example, obvious measures that we had to take, like any other company, was to eliminate as many contract positions as possible, because straightforward answer was that demand did not exist to justify those positions. But as far as the permanent workforce was concerned, we are at the end of the day anticipating a recovery quite strongly. And in fact, that recovery has come. So after the first lockdown 1 or lockdown 2, the Gujarat plant came back pretty rapidly online. And fortunately, we had already manufactured excess inventory and put it into the market before the COVID crisis forced a lockdown. But at this point, the plant is manufacturing inventory for the rest of the year. We haven't really resorted to any large-scale retrenchments other than what we would probably normally do for performance reasons. That's not to say that we may not have to take these steps in the future. What I'm trying to say is that these steps are very big steps to take, and we have to be very responsible and try and balance out both the humanitarian aspect as well as the long-term business case before resorting to steps like this. Now, if I were a different industry, for example, the hospitality industry or the aviation industry, I would have probably a different answer to your question. But because I'm fortunate enough to be in the industry that I am in, I think this is where we find ourselves.
Yes.
But it is, we do have to take steps to conserve liquidity pretty aggressively. So, as far as possible, reducing cash burn through various measures like eliminating contractors, not just contract labor, but external consultants, for example, putting investment projects on the back burner, chasing aggressively for recovery of overdues and dues, getting credit lines from our banking partners. These are all ways in which we preserve and conserve liquidity. At the same time, we will probably have an impact in terms of bonuses, promotions, etc. for the year. Hiring has been put on a standstill. So while we are facing regular attrition, we are not backfilling those positions, which means we're saving millions of dollars at a global level. So these are ways in which we are trying to continue operation while minimizing the impact on our workforce. In some countries, we've still had to implement furloughs, which are temporary, no work, no pay kind of scenarios in our case. So, some companies have done furloughs which are very disruptive. For example, take a bunch of people, throw them on furlough, indefinite furlough, and say for the next, say 2 or 3 months, we have no idea whether we'll have work for you, so no salary either. But at the end of it, if we do have work, then we bring you back in. We have not done that in our company in any country. Instead, wherever possible and required, we have requested people to take maybe a day off per week, but they will still work for the remaining 4 days and still get paid for those 4 days. So the idea has always been to try and minimize the impact on our workforce and avoid layoff as much as we can, so that not only are we keeping our employees employed, but at the same time we're also protecting our long-term capabilities and interests.
Yes.
Thank you, Kaustav. So Dathan has raised his hand. He's waiting since long. So Dathan, Vijay, and then Florence. Yeah?
Thank you.
Sure. Yes, Nathan, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks so much for painting the overall HR picture and not specific about talent management itself. Just my question is on this aspect where you showed the 3 aspects of purpose, agility, and the other was in terms of empathy. Just want to ask, how do you ensure leadership cohesiveness at the highest level to drive this movement towards purpose, empathy, and agility, especially considering the insecurities that come to the fore in such a time of crisis?
Great question. And the answer is, at the end of the day, we are all human. So leadership is also human. And we act as a community. It's very rare that you see one person whose wit runs wild across the organization. And therefore that person's idiosyncrasies end up influencing the entire organization. You see that perhaps in founder-led companies during the early stages of the evolution, right? But in a global corporation that is owned by 2 massive conglomerates, which are over 100 years old each, the level of maturity of the leadership, as well as the decentralized authority available to leadership and the power of influence available to individual leaders is quite high. And that helps us, I think, to counterbalance each other's extreme instincts, if you will, and take a more mature decision as a community of leaders rather than as an individual. So that is the theoretical answer. In our own company's case, I think we saw more or less an expression of that theoretical answer. So different stakeholders in the leadership community were trying to drive different angles from their own functional perspective. For example, the CFO might take a very different stance to the CHRO, which is expected. That is their job, right? A CLO would take a very different stance because they're covering their angle. That's why they're there. That's why they're being paid as applicant. But at the end of the day, all decision making happens through discussion and consensus. And so the CEO brings people together. And one of the complications perhaps of our company is that we are also accountable to a global governing organization, the parent company, which is JCI in our case. So there are obviously imperatives that are driven down from the parent as well. But the flip side is that our workforce is, of a certain background. We are basically a Hitachi company. The workforce, almost all our plants are formerly Hitachi plants. And so the culture the expectation of the employees there, the social position that we've created for ourselves over decades of operation in the countries and cities we operate in, the relationships that we have with our governments, stakeholders, are all from that angle. We are basically a Hitachi culture. And I'm sure, Nitin, you would have heard this phrase that when culture and strategy clash, culture eats strategy for breakfast. So if we are a mature leadership group, we have to respect and recognize that fact. And the decisions that we take have to be in alignment with the fundamental tenets of our culture, the Hitachi culture. So therefore, I think that is the approach that we have taken. But I'm quite conscious of many other organizations that have taken a very different approach, especially those companies that have taken a hard commercial approach to handling this problem. I think we have all been witness to how their reputation has fared on the internet. How many of us would, in future, those of us who consider ourselves top-notch professionals, experienced one, would go and, would be open to a job opportunity at a leadership level in one of those companies in the future? Tell me. I would not. I would choose and pick the people that I work with, right? So they will pay the price in the talent market at leadership levels. They may never be aware of it, but they will certainly pay the price. And that's unfortunate. But that's probably how Darwin theory works in the corporate world from a talent perspective. Hope that answers the question.
Thanks, Kaustav. There is a question from Vijaya. With a lot of salary cuts happening, what can HR as a role do to keep the morale up of the employees?
Okay, I will try to answer this question. So while one side of reality has been that companies have had to take, as we like to call it, difficult but responsible measures to protect our business, right? The other side of the story has also been that employee belief in their leadership and the strategy to face this crisis is actually at its highest in history, or among almost highest in history. Almost across the board, 75-80% of the employees being surveyed in different engagement surveys across different platforms have expressed very strong faith in their leadership, as well as very strong satisfaction in how the leadership has handled this crisis. And the reasons are there for everybody to see. Today, if we have a discussion with an employee group and tell them, look, we are not going to go for salary increases this year, promotions this year, or we expect you to volunteer to take a pay cut for a certain period in order to protect the survival of the business, they realize and they understand it is the truth. We would rather take a pay cut for, let's say, a month or maybe a day a week for the next, say, 2 months, than be forced to lay off somebody who could be me or who could be a colleague of mine or a friend of mine. It's just common sense. Furthermore, responsible decision making, like I said earlier, involves not impacting your permanent capability as an organization. So losing people, some of who may have worked with you for 10 or 20 years, who may be wonderful, consistent high performers, does not make sense in a crisis like this, where you need the same people to claw back your market share and regain your profitability, maybe in just a month or 2 months' time when the markets start opening up. So I think we need to take a look at this as a marathon and not as a sprint. And employees are very wise about this and realize that's what the government, the company leadership is also trying to do. So that being the case, the point really boils down to openness, transparency, communication, empathy. If you can take your people in confidence, let them know that this is what we are trying to achieve and this is how we want you to step up. And everybody's in the same boat. So if you're asking, for example, employees to take a 20% furlough, which means 1 day a week off and no pay for, hypothetically, say the next 1 month, right? The obvious question the employee asks is, okay, I can do that. I'm willing to volunteer, but does the same rule apply to everybody from the CEO downwards? Which is a fair question. If that answer is yes, then you see a huge amount of voluntary participation in programs like this. 80%, 90%, close to 100%. And actually, this has been a kind of revelatory measure for many companies, HR leaders who didn't believe that they would have employees volunteering in these programs. But from all the conversations that I've had, people have been extremely, proactive and supportive when the organization has to take tough measures like this. People understand. So that's, I think, what it boils down to. It, like I said, it's about profit to purpose. It's about focusing on empathy and not efficiency. The same lessons I think have borne out eminently well in companies. Now, an example of, say, several companies that publicly laid off people, and these people came out on the internet, on LinkedIn, for example, right? You have two groups of people. There are some companies where people come out and say, yesterday was my last day working with this particular company. I'm very thankful to them. This has been a great journey. I wish them all the best. My colleagues are still there. And now I'm open to other opportunities. Very, very positive way of saying the same thing, right? And there are other companies where you have videos circulating about how miserably the communication happened, and people coming up and saying, I've lost my job, I need help, I'm desperate, and so on and so forth. So clearly in the same circumstance, companies have a choice how to handle this. And there are companies that have done a great job of being transparent, open, and asking employees for support and getting it. It's a lesson for all of us, I think.
Yeah, thanks, Kaustav. And I'm cognizant of the time, so just take a last question from Florence. Yes, Florence, go ahead.
Well, good evening to everyone. I hope I'm audible.
Yes, you are.
Yeah. In the context of what you were talking about, Mr. Chakravarthy, I think the reality of the situation is much larger than what we see. And the second thing is that talking about employees and talent management, I don't think they are change ready right now, because the skills that are required today is more technology in terms of data science and machine learning and all data analytics, etc., which reflect the culture. Now, I would like to ask you your perspective about how do you think that you would help your employees who have served you for even 10 or 12 years in such a situation? This is one perspective and question. The second one is that the country has been quite lethargic in terms of reacting to the COVID pandemic. But prior to this situation, IT companies were already downsizing in thousands. So people have a mindset that at any time they're going to lose their job, and the company is not going to take care of them. That's for sure. The third perspective is that how do you help to coach people who are in trouble at this point of time, expecting a transformation when there are no jobs, the economy is very, very down, and they don't have money, and they just don't know how to do their job because they're working from home, and that is quite a disruptive procedure. The second thing, lastly, I would say is that working from home is not a culture in India. So people need to understand this and be motivated to work from home because they have no other option. But the company has a great responsibility towards its employees. So how would you like to respond to this kind of a situation and the perspectives that I shared? I would be happy to hear from you. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Lawrence. Many questions. You will have to help me choose one that I can answer.
How do you keep your employees happy and expect them to drive talent management when they don't have a job? The economy is down. They are under lockdown, creating mental health issues. What is the company going to do?
Yeah, so I can only answer from my organization's perspective, obviously. I would not want to theorize on someone else's behalf. And so the response I can give you would be limited in that context. That's the first thing I want to say.
If I may just intervene in here.
Yeah.
I'm talking about people, irrespective of from which industry, in general. I'm also a HR personnel, and so I'm talking about it from a general perspective.
I can't answer that question because there is no one answer to that question. How do you motivate someone who doesn't have a job versus how do you
motivate somebody who doesn't know what is expected from him because he is not geared for it?
Okay. I think that's a good question actually, because if you don't have role clarity, you get disengaged. If you don't have the right tools that enable you to perform well, you would get disengaged. If you don't have as an employee the right social network, framework, backbone to support you as a human being, you would get disengaged. So in fact, I wrote I would request you to go through my LinkedIn profile. There was an article that I published, I think about a week or a few days, 10 days back, on why high performers leave. And I believe the answer to that question in some way also answers today's question, because it boils down to human motivation, right? Now, without getting into Maslow's theory of need hierarchy, which people have trained dry of content over the decades, I like to keep my story very simple, right? I try and follow Dan Pink's theory of motivation. Dan Pink, about 10 years back, made a revolutionary speech at RCA. The link is in the article on LinkedIn, where he said, once you take money off the table, that's you pay people enough that their requirements are taken care of to live a comfortable, safe, and future-oriented life with enough investment. Once you do that, it then boils down to only three things to keep them motivated, right? And those three things he said are autonomy, opportunity for mastery, and a sense of purpose. Just these three things. Autonomy, right? The opportunity for people to do what they think is required to be done without fearing somebody looking over their shoulder and micromanaging them all the time. Treating me like an adult is autonomy. Give me the broad parameters of what you want to be done. Tell me what you expect, and let me figure out my way to do it, because my method may be different from your method. So treat me as a professional. Second, mastery. The opportunity for people to continuously get better at what they're doing and know that they're getting better through feedback. It's like playing a video game. Why do I play video games? Because number one, nobody is micromanaging me on how to, kill a particular enemy or get a particular puzzle solved. And the more I play, the better I get. And I can see that because I keep leveling up, right? And finally, sense of purpose. People today no longer want to just be in a company which is there for the sole purpose of making more and more profit and, meeting quarterly commitments to its stakeholders or shareholders, right? But what they want to do is to be a part of a movement. And you're seeing talent clearly move from companies that are profit-driven to purpose-driven. It's very, very clear. It's a known fact. So therefore, sense of purpose means what? That I'm doing something which is not just aimed at my limited objectives or my small little life, but actually bettering society as a whole. I'm part of a much bigger movement, a much bigger, shall I say, mission than that. So as long as people get these three basic motivators right, autonomy, mastery, and sense of purpose, motivating them is easy because they will motivate themselves. That's just how human beings run. Now, in a crisis like this, agreeably, there are challenges in making that happen. As you rightly pointed out, people may have lost their jobs. They may be in circumstances and situations that they're completely uncomfortable with. They may be under fear of losing their jobs because the company probably has gone through multiple rounds of layoffs and they're wondering if the axe will next fall on their own necks. Right? They probably don't see a very big future for themselves depending on the industry that they're in. And perhaps all of this is causing physical as well as psychological illness or pain in these people. And so to some degree, I think human resources professionals are grappling, as you rightly said, with a much bigger problem than purely the economic safety and security of their organizations and their business units. Some of these consequences of the crisis are beyond their ability to influence or even imagine, perhaps. You're right. But we can only do the best that we can do. And not everything is under our control. Human resources professionals, more than anybody else, have to recognize this today. And I like to say this quite extensively. The bigger problem than keeping my organization and my employees motivated is to make sure that my own team members in the human resources function are motivated and engaged. Because as a HR professional, you probably realize very often HR functions, HR team members are kind of distributed and isolated in the offices in which they work. You probably, more often than not, you're one of the two people or the three people are probably the only person from HR in your office. And it's very difficult for genuine relationships to form in those circumstances where everybody is looking at you as a means to an end. And so one of my functions as a leader today is that first and foremost, I have to be the best friend for my own team members. I need to be able to be the sounding board, the panic room that these people can reach out to, express themselves, call when they need to. And as HR professionals, if we can overcome our own emotions, our own challenges, then we kind of focus outward, Arbinger's, the outward mindset comes to mind. where we try and look at how to empower, enable, and support our colleagues and team members through this crisis using empathy, using emotional intelligence. But at the same time, trying and using all of our skills to balance the company's requirements along with the individual employees' requirements. But all said and done, this is only half the answer, because I firmly believe every employee is responsible for their own motivation, for their own productivity, their own training, their own upskilling, as much as the organization is responsible for creating an ecosystem where inhibitions or obstructions are removed and they can go out and do their best. So I think what we can do is provide a helping hand, provide an ecosystem that is fair and empowering and enabling and transparent and open. But we will also expect, frankly speaking, employees to step up and do their share of learning, do their share of contribution. It doesn't help in a circumstance like this to separate management from employees. We are all a community that drives an organization forward, and we exist for the organization just as much as the organization exists for us. So people are expected to, step up and do their part in this process as well. Unfortunately, not everybody will make the cut, but that's just the way organizations go. Sometimes your skilling is no longer relevant. You need to figure out ways of upskilling yourself. And the organization has some avenues that you can use, but you shouldn't be limiting yourself to those avenues. You should go out and get the skills that you require and bring them to bear as a professional on your job. That's just the reality of it.
And I just asked one.
No, sorry, Florence, I'm very cognizant. We are really overshot. Any
right.
questions,
Thank you very
please
much.
write to us and we will reach out to Kaustav for the responses. So
Thank you.
cannot really go beyond that. Thank you so much, Kaustav. And there are a lot of compliments coming in the chat box for your presentation. Personally, very, very interesting, very insightful presentation. And thank you so much for being there. And thank you everybody for being there. Have a good evening. All right.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.